Today we're going to take a look at Zeus and Hera alone, and the next time we're going to do some more gods, etc. And so we're going to talk about all the different Olympians. And what I'll try to do for you guys is, after years of giving a damn about this stuff, getting in my bones what I consider to be most important about understanding who these different gods and heroes are, and extend it to our own world, the sense of what's the significance here. So when it comes to Zeus, obviously the most important thing to know is that he's the king of the gods. And so for ancient Greece, the very notion of king, and also, as we'll see when we get to Rome, in Rome as well, is a very loaded word and a very loaded notion. This idea of one, in the case of human beings, person, or in the case of the gods, God, running everything, being the ruler of it all. For the Greeks, this notion has a lot of paradox to it. Okay, unlike, say, in Egypt, where it's pretty straightforward, the pharaoh is the king. And in our own world, there are societies where if you walk outside this room and say the king is you go to prison for probably 20 years. Okay, it's just a fact. And I'm not even thinking of one particular part of the world right now. In Greece, you didn't get arrested for saying terrible things about the king when there were kings, in the most ancient periods of Greece. But it wasn't exactly looked up. It wasn't exactly considered an okay thing to do. But once monarchy was overturned in Greece, the very notion of a king became opprobrious for the Greeks, and this is the same thing with the Romans as well. Once that occurred, then it was not only allowed, but it was encouraged for the very idea of there being one king to be looked down upon. Okay, and so what was it replaced by? In Greece, it was replaced by several archons. And it depends on what period of history you're looking at, but it was always more than one, the equivalent of the executive branch of the U.S. Okay, in Rome it was two. It was the consuls. Okay, and there were two instead of one. But Greece and Rome have in common that their history began with one king, and then it was replaced by more than one executive, whether it be two or more. Okay, that's what you guys need to understand. So this idea of Zeus being the king of the gods within the context of a real-world society that worshipped the Olympian gods in earnest, for real, no joke. It wasn't pure fiction. It wasn't pure mythology or literature per se, but rather the real world, real worship, real religion. That had some interesting kind of paradoxes to it. And Zeus himself, more than any of the other Olympians, when it comes to, I would say, ethics, okay, not when it comes to everything, because Apollo is very paradoxical in his own way, but when it comes to ethics, Zeus is by far the most paradoxical of the Olympians. And what do I mean by that? I mean that on the one hand, he's the king of the gods. On the other hand, he does everything he can to have sex with anybody other than his wife. Okay, so we have some weird stuff going on here with the king of the gods and the king of the supposed king of justice, the patron of justice among the Olympians. So I'm contrasting Zeus with Apollo when it comes to the notion of paradox, with this notion of Zeus on the one hand being the king of the gods, and on the other hand being a total cut-up. And there are others in both the pantheon of gods as well as among heroes who go further than that and curse him. Okay, and curse him. Call him pretty much the equivalent of an offspring. Okay, so there's very interesting stuff going on with Zeus. So let's take a look when we consider the various things to cover when it comes to Zeus, at what nominally Zeus is, okay, what he's called, such as, for example, the god of justice, and then kind of the realities behind it, and see if that has some significance. Okay, as opposed to someone, as we'll get to later, like Athena, who is called the goddess of strategic aspects of war and is 100% straightforwardly that, and also considered to be the goddess of wisdom and is 100% straightforwardly that. You get what I'm saying? So there's an interesting contrast between Olympians who fall in line with their ideal, the ideal that people impose on them, right, in connection with who they are, their identity, and then those who don't. Okay, so as far as Zeus himself goes, what's his story? What's the domain? Okay, he's the sky god, and don't forget why. Okay, he's the sky god because of the lottery after the Titanomachy. Battle with the Titans, battle of the Titans. And his most common and most illustrative epithet in Homer is cloud gatherer, to reflect the fact that he's the god of the sky. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Don't forget they were born in the same generation, and they were the only males. That's interesting, right? There are 3 males and 3 females in that brood. And the 3 males, it was taken for granted that they were the ones to do the lottery for who got to rule the universe. Okay. Now this tripartite division of the universe of Olympus, Earth level, and then the underworld is reflective of a great amount of ancient Greek conception of lots and lots of things as having 3-part structures. Okay, this is a real pattern throughout Greek thought. In, for example, Plato, in his Timaeus, in his famous kind of creation myth dialogue, he gets into that idea of a tripartite division of the universe, etc. Okay, so this is a pretty common way of looking at the universe. First thing to know about Zeus, as illustrated in Book 8 of the Iliad very prominently, is he is by far the strongest, physically speaking, of all the Olympians, to such an extent that if all of them were on the other end of a rope or a gold cord, as it says in Book 8 of the Iliad, not only would he win the tug of war with all other 11 Olympians, okay, including Athena, including the goddess of war, including Ares, throw them all over there. Not only that, but he'd pretty much do the equivalent of grabbing it with one hand and just swinging them around, kind of like superhero type stuff. Okay, he's that much stronger than the rest of the Olympians, because we kind of need that. We need that in his makeup, in his profile, in order to realize that he has the physical strength to take care of anything he needs to and more. And so there's no ambiguity there in terms of his greater strength than anyone else. And so there's the quote. I usually won't quote things forever for you guys, but this one bears looking at. So, let down out of the sky a cord of gold, lay hold of it, all you who are gods and all who are goddesses, yet not even so can you drag down Zeus from the sky to the ground. Not Zeus the high lord of counsel, although you try until you grow weary. Yet whenever I might strongly be minded to pull you, I could drag you up, earth and all, and sea and all with you. So not just them, but the whole earth, the sky. You're getting the point. Very cosmic. I was deducing from this that if he could lift up earth and sky and everything in the universe, it would be nothing for him to kind of twirl them around on his finger. That's kind of the idea here. Then fetch the golden rope about the horn of Olympus and make it so fast that all once more should dangle in midair. So much stronger am I than all the rest. Okay. Another thing associated with Zeus is the aegis. Aegis comes from an ancient Greek word for goat. And remember the story about Rhea giving birth to Zeus and having him be raised on the island of Crete away from Cronus? Well, when he was born there, when he was raised there, he was raised and tutored by a centaur, because that's kind of paradoxical, a half human, half animal raised Zeus. But also, he was raised by this goat, this female goat, this she-goat that he nursed from. So she nursed him because, obviously, Rhea wasn't around to do that. And so what did he do once he was raised by the she-goat? He sacrificed the goat in order to serve as a model for those who are reading about him. He provided an example of the necessity of worshiping the gods through sacrifice. And so he sacrificed this goat, and the goat skin of Amalthea was used to make his shield. Now that shield, once Athena was born out of his head, after he swallowed Metis and all that stuff, that goat skin shield was given to Athena as a gift, okay, from Zeus. And so from that point on, Athena was associated with the aegis. Okay, now aegis is a word in English that is sometimes used. So classical mythology, the shield or breastplate of Zeus or Athena, and then protection. And so it's, so obviously a shield protects one. And so this idea of protection or support under the imperial aegis, or a debate under the aegis of the League of Women Voters. So in other words, supported by or sponsored by. There is an example of our own society using an ancient Greek word directly, okay, in order to get across an idea. So Zeus is always, just like Thor, his hammer, right? So you know that Zeus's thunderbolt is not only the one weapon that is consistent every time he is mentioned or depicted, but pretty much always. Okay, you're rarely going to find a vase painting or wall painting that depicts Zeus that doesn't either have his thunderbolt or his animal, which is the eagle, but sometimes the eagle is missing, but almost never is the thunderbolt missing. Okay, just like the trident with Poseidon, as we'll see. This kind of stuff makes it that much easier to recognize these figures. If you go to a museum, if you go online, you look at a gallery of images of these or just Google image, whatever, and you type in Zeus, and you look, it's the thunderbolt that's going to give him away. Okay, and obviously that symbolizes the fact that he's the god of the sky and responsible for thunder and lightning, and that, by extension, symbolizes the fact that the Olympian gods are the children of entities who represent natural phenomena. So never forget that. Zeus is 2 generations away from Earth and sky and Tartarus and darkness and Oceanus, the ocean that circles the world. Okay, really a river. As we cover each of these gods and goddesses and heroes, some more than others, there's going to be 1 or 2 things that tip you off, usually just one, to what god or goddess or hero it is. And that makes mythology really simple. The most difficult aspect of mythology is just how many variations there are on facts, okay? But also how many stories there are about the different gods. So, for example, Zeus and all of his different dalliances with people and gods other than Hera. His nickname, Olympios, comes from the Greek. It means the Olympian one for 2 reasons. One obvious one is that he's the king of the gods on Olympus, on Mount Olympus in northern Greece. So Olympios means the Olympian one, and it's referring, first of all, to his being king on Mount Olympus. First, the idea of Mount Olympus is connected to the geographical feature that you can actually visit in northern Greece on the border of Thessaly and Macedon. That's one of the reasons he's called that. And then eventually it becomes more associated with a kind of abstract idea of heaven, although the difference obviously being human beings don't go there. It's occupied only by the Olympians. So that's a giant difference, but it's still above, and it's where more or less decent beings live. Okay, as opposed to something like Tartarus in the underworld, where it's unequivocally terrible beings. The other reason why Zeus has the nickname Olympios, he's also the patron of Olympia. Now, this is the more exciting reason. First of all, let's get into this idea of what a shrine is in the first place. In ancient Greece, you had a society where it was a giant deal to be able, for those in power, to convince those not in power that they all belong to one society, one nation. Why? Biggest reason? War. A common effort against whatever foreign foe there might be was the biggest reason. And so how do you do that? How the hell do you convince all of these city-states around Greece who are separated from each other by these tall mountains? When you go to Greece, right away, mountains, sea, and sky are right in front of you as the most conspicuous geographical features that pervade the Greek mindset right away. You notice that. But another thing to mention is it's not just a matter of the mountains being tall, it's a matter of them being numerous. So numerous that this idea of there being so many mountains where the valleys between them are shut off from the other valleys, so much so that it even a mountain chain that is, for example, where Attica, the place where Athens is, the adjacent areas to Attica, to any of the most important places in Greece, might as well be thousands of miles away. They're so isolated from each other because of the altitude of the mountains and because of how difficult it was in the ancient world to trek over those mountains and to get to the other side. Every once in a while you had a pass, but then that was too dangerous, though, as far as war goes, so usually there wasn't. And so it was a giant deal to go from one city-state to another. So given that fact, given the pragmatics of that, it was a really tough sell to convince people in Athens, people in Delphi, people in Corinth, people in Thrace, etc., all over Greece, that they all belong to the same thing. We take that stuff for granted in our society, although we shouldn't. We're called the United States of America. Okay, so subliminally, at the very least, the Founding Fathers intended for it to be out in the open and to be in our face and say, hey, you guys, we're united. You know, and you read the Federalist Papers and all that, and the debates about whether there should be a union in the first place. It's a giant deal for the U.S. as well, at the very beginning of the U.S., this idea of, first of all, whether there should be uniting of the various colonies, but second of all, once you do, how the hell are you going to keep it together? How are you going to convince everybody to fight together, to consider each other the different states to be part of one nation when it comes to culture, when it comes to literature, and American literature. It took a long time for that idea to get off the ground. That was a big deal for us at the beginning of our history, and it was even more so for the Greeks, because of the greater difficulty of traveling from one place to another in the extremely mountainous territory of ancient Greece. And so what did you do? What are the different glues that kept everyone feeling like they all belonged to one thing? Think about it. Say you're trying to do that. Say you have scores of city-states. What were the things that those in power used in order to convince those not in power that they all should fight together in a war? Shared history, shared identity, at least a fabricated one, because at first that's the only you can do, is you can fabricate a shared identity. Mythos first means word, and then it means story. Really the glue, the multifaceted glue that tied everything together, everything had to do with this idea of communication. It had to do with language. It had to do what you do with language in the form of making stories. And it had to do with what you do with those stories, making history. And so it just really all connects. And the real world, that's why myth and history in the ancient world are so tied together in a way that you don't get if you think of myth as nothing but stories. Okay, it's stories, and they're amazing and they're fun. But it's also extremely important to understand myth in order to get a grip on ancient history as well. And then, in my opinion, by extension, history at all. History of the world, at least the Western world. It's all about beginnings, where things come from and why they are what they are. And so the Greek language, Greek mythology / religion, and then eventually Greek history, those are the things that grow out of this very idea of a shared tongue. That's what a language is. Along the lines of religion, how the heck, other than doing what Narmer did and propagating stories that deal with unification, kind of suggestive way of trying to get people to merge in North and South Egypt. But when it comes to Greek religion, think about how ingenious it was to come up with this idea. First of all, you have a mythology that all of the Greeks around Greece, no matter, and by the way, the very idea of naming them one thing is a big deal. So all those who inhabit Hellas, Hellas, is the name they used for themselves. Okay, the idea of Greece, that comes in the 18th century of our era. Officially for them having a sovereign state in Greece. Okay, that didn't come until 1800s in our era. But back then, this very idea of Greece being connected, the most spiritually powerful way of convincing everybody that they belong to the same thing was, number one, you have a common mythology, a common pantheon of gods, Zeus, Hera, Athena, etc. You have Hesiod with his theogony, explaining where the universe came from, and where the gods came from, how Zeus became the king of the gods, and who the other siblings were, and then eventually, with other stories that follow Hesiod, what other gods followed, so that there are 12 official, canonical Olympians up in Olympus. So you get that across to people all over the way, in various ways. In literature, it's just mentioned, Athena enters the picture. Who's Athena? Oh, you know who Athena is. Athena is one of the Olympians. Okay, that's a very subtle form of propaganda, in a not necessarily malicious way. Okay, I'm using propaganda, believe it or not, in a kind of neutral way. I'm talking about just what we're talking about now, the importance of convincing people that they all belong to one thing. When you have one pantheon, and then in Corinth, the people of Corinth say, hey, Poseidon is our god, and then in Athens, hey, Athena is our god, and in Olympia, hey, Zeus is our god. What's going on here? Think about that. Considering how hard it was to get from one place to another in ancient Greece, these places might as well be as big as 10 times that geographically, okay, to get from, and because of the mountains especially. So think about it. Someone in Sparta is worshiping Ares, and someone way up here in Delphi is worshiping Apollo. Do you see how ingenious that is? That's not the same as saying in Sparta they're worshiping Apollo and in Delphi they're worshiping Apollo. Hey, we're the same. No. So you're able to variegate the number of people in that idea of religion as opposed to it being a monotheistic religion. It's many, many gods and goddesses. And within that context, you have someone worshiping one of those gods way down here and someone worshiping one of those gods way up there and all over the place. And this is just, the most important of those areas where that kind of worship was going on. That's powerful now, right? Think about that. That's extremely powerful. Now you think about the equivalent in our day, it's most common for there to be monotheistic religions in our world now. And so, it's a little more difficult when it comes to that. If it were one God with a capital G in ancient Greece, it would have been more difficult, to convince people, wait a minute, we're the best worshipers of God with a capital G. No, we are. In this case, you're not fighting over who's the best worshipers of the one God, but rather you have yours, you have yours, you have yours, and then subliminally, in the background, whoa, they all belong to one system. Okay, you see what I'm saying? And so that system is, I'm going to give you a fancy word here, isomorphic with the attempted political realities of the real world. In other words, you want everybody to be together on the same team politically. Why not represent that togetherness mythically / religiously? And it worked. Okay? Now, how did it work? It's way beyond what I said so far. You not only have Sparta worshiping one god, Olympia another, etc., but when I say worshiping, I mean worshiping. I mean, number one, dedicating an extremely elaborate temple to the patron god or goddess of your city-state, and then making a giant deal out of that worship. The most conspicuous example of this, obviously, is Athens, for gosh sake, named after Athena. How much more obvious can you get? When we get to Poseidon and Athena, I'll get into why Athena is the patron goddess of Athens. But what I want to consider today in a more general sense is this very idea of various shrines around Greece. Okay? Shrine, place of worship. A shrine is the area enclosing the main temple to a given god or goddess. Okay, so you have the temple to a god or goddess, and then the sacred precincts constitute the shrine. In the mythical world, you have a shrine, and then within the shrine, a temple. And in the real world, you have a precinct called Attica, and then within that precinct, you have the city-state called Athens. So Zeus is the patron god of Olympia. Now let me give you an idea of how elaborate we're talking about when it comes to the temple and the precincts. There's Olympia. As far as the archaeologists are able to reconstruct it, it's nothing like this today in terms of what ruins remain, but it's worth visiting. And here's the Olympic Stadium over here, and here's the temple of Zeus at Olympia. And as I say in the book, on this end here, there's sculpture that is in that pedimental area where the pediment is, the triangular area, that depicts the events leading up to a famous chariot race. And so it's facing the very place where races occurred. So both on foot and also via chariot. So you have this kind of shrine that is devoted to one god or goddess in all of the major population centers of Greece in the ancient world. And in each of these population centers, something big happened once a year. Okay, so, or every 4 years in the case of Olympia. The Olympics. Okay, so here at Olympia, the Olympics were founded in the 700s BC, even before Homer, the beginning of the Archaic period, end of the Dark Age. And so every 4 years, those who could afford it, and those who were sent out for whatever reason by their respective polis would travel far to get to this shrine in order to watch the Olympics and maybe be part of it even. Here's the temple of Zeus, and then this tiny little temple here is the temple of Hera. So you got Zeus and you got Hera. So there's the husband, there's the wife, there's the king, there's the queen, and they're both facing where the Olympics occur. Okay, so that's good enough for now to deal with Olympios. So 2 reasons why he's called Olympios. Then he's also referred to as Hortios, and that has to do with oaths, oath-keeping, making sure that those who promise something keep their oath. Now, part of this ingenuity that I'm talking about having a given city-state worship one god or goddess more than any other, ignores one important fact. And that is that just because there's one god or goddess that is focused on in a given city-state doesn't mean that because of that connection of that one god or goddess belonging to the pantheon, that they're not responsible for any kind of wrath that might come to their city-state by any of the gods or goddesses in Olympus. Okay? So Athena or Poseidon or whatever might get pissed off at what Olympia is doing on an international level, not just Zeus. Okay, that's important to understand. It's not like, hey, as long as we make Zeus happy, we're good. No. Okay, so there was always one figurehead that represented the worship of a given city-state, but it wasn't limited to that. And so the reason I mention that is that when you talk about Zeus being keeper of oaths, it doesn't mean that Olympia and those within Olympia are the only ones who have to worry about Zeus's potential wrath if there's a giant lie that is committed. Okay, and when we talk about these kinds of lies, it's not as much personal lies as it is more political lies between city-states, or lies between Olympia and one or more city-states on the one hand, and a foreign, say, nation on the other. So Zeus is the lord of keeping track of who's telling lies and who isn't. But then here we go with the paradox. Because Zeus, the keeper of oaths, is also the dude who's a sneaky little guy who runs around and trying to have sex with whoever at any time. Okay? Why is that important? You guys can't forget about the very purpose. Forget about political stuff for a second. What we talked about today with propaganda. Think about even further back. This idea of the very idea of having myth in the first place has a lot to do with coming to terms with mortality and coming to terms with the imperfections of human beings. And so unlike, say, Egypt, where you have gods that are depicted as more or less perfect, okay, and way in a different realm than humans, the Greek gods and goddesses, as we'll see, the more of them we get to, are depicted a lot more human-like, a lot more anthropomorphically with the shapes of human beings. When you have a guy who is considered to be the keeper of oaths doing those kinds of things he does behind Hera's back, what does that mean? Does it mean it's nothing but Zeus is an a-hole? No. It's a mirror onto human beings. It's this idea that your gods are, on the one hand, those that you worship in order for everything to go okay, but on the other hand, they themselves aren't perfect. It's a whole other paradigm for understanding the role of gods within a kind of what we can call religious context. Okay? Let's not fool ourselves. Myth/religion is what we're talking about here for the ancient Greeks, and even more so for the Romans. Now, by the way, when we get to some of these gods, we're going to be branching off a little from the state religion. When we get to Dionysus and Demeter in particular, and we're going to be talking about a kind of alternate religion in each case, which should be read as kind of a dissident religion, okay? Alternative religion, okay, when we get to them. So he's the defender of Dike. He's a defender of an ancient word, Dike, meaning right, and Dikaiosune, meaning justice. And so what is Dike? Dike comes from an ancient Greek term meaning pointing things out. He's the king, he's the god of making sure that what the state has pointed out as being the proper way to behave is upheld. Quite often, a Greek word, an ancient Greek word, cannot be defined by one English word. Okay, very frequently, that's the case. And this is a good example of that. Dike, yeah, it's often translated as justice, but it really comes from a verb meaning that, do that. He's the god of making sure that you do the things that the state says, do that. You see what I'm saying? Okay, and that's, in an ancient Greek context, justice. Doing the things that the state tells you is right and wrong. Okay? And so Zeus is the god of that. He's also, and this is, again, I think, the last one that I throw at you, because there's so many. As the king of the gods, you can imagine, there are lots of domains that Zeus is in charge of. And here's another, and in some ways the most important, because it links worship of Zeus to the real world, maybe more poignantly than any of these others, and that is Xenios. That's another nickname of his, Xenios. And what does that mean? It means a lot of, there's not one English word for it. It means the patron of hospitality and guests. He's the patron of guest friendship, is usually how it's defined. The patron of guest friendship. What does that mean? Only way to get it is to understand that in ancient Greece, as hard as it is to believe, but less so these days with Airbnb and stuff like that. It's getting a little more chill when it comes to these notions, except you have to pay in that case. In ancient Greece, all the way up until the Hellenistic period, the latest periods of Greece, it was required, not by law, but by religion, by a fear of Zeus, if you disobeyed this notion, that if someone comes to your door, hungry and or exhausted, you had to give them food and you had to let them sleep. You had a separate area for that in your place. Okay? No matter how small or how big it was, you were expected to obey the dictates of guest friendship, of what's called xenia, the ancient Greek word meaning guest friendship, or really what I just described. Xenos means foreigner or stranger. What English word comes from xenos? Xenophobia. It's used all the time these days. Xenophobia means fear of foreigners, fear of people not from where you are from. Zeus was the god of making sure you weren't xenophobic. There's a little difference, right? Because it doesn't mean people from outside of your polis as much as it means anybody who doesn't live in your house who comes by and needs something, you help them out. And if you don't, you're punished by Zeus. Okay, now, if you take a look at Wikipedia at Zeus and you see all the children of Zeus, you will thank me for not going over all of them because it would take the whole semester. Lots and lots and lots and lots of offspring by lots and lots and lots and lots of both mortals and immortals. So let's get to some of the more important ones. We already know about Athena. Don't forget how she was born when Zeus swallowed Metis, his first wife, in order to prevent the oracle from continuing on, perpetuating itself. And by the way, the fact that it ended with Zeus, the third in the succession myth. And we will get to Apollo and Artemis later. Leto is going to end up being the mother of Apollo and Artemis. And from Themis comes the seasons. So the seasons and law, this idea of order. Zeus keeping order in the universe, despite being a serial adulterer. It's very paradoxical. Mnemosyne means memory in ancient Greek. And she's a Titaness that Zeus had an affair with. And they gave birth to the 9 muses, who inspire artists of various kinds, including historians. Historians were included in that. But epic poets, musicians, lyric poets, etc. We're going to get back to the muses when we get to Homer, because at the beginning of each of his epics, he prays to the muse. So we'll get a little bit into what the significance of that is later. Just trying to give you a general overview of some of the more important offspring of Zeus. And in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Theogony, the muses are prayed to at the very beginning of each of these works. So there's a tradition of doing that, and so we'll get more into that when we get to Homer. Okay. When Zeus has affairs with mortals, not always female, sometimes male, he disguises himself if he can't reveal who he really is. And so he disguises himself in various forms. When it comes to this mortal named Leda, he transforms himself into a swan. Europa, after which Europe is named, he transforms himself into a bull. And then Ganymede, it's a boy, and he swoops down and kidnaps him as an eagle, right? He's almost always depicted either with a thunderbolt or an eagle. So enough about Zeus for now. By no means was this intended to be anything close to a comprehensive intro to Zeus, or will it be to any of the other Olympians. The idea here is to get internalized to some extent who the heck these figures are, so then when we see them in Homer, then when we see them in Greek tragedy, etc., they'll have a lot more resonance for you than if we didn't do this. At least I hope so. Okay. Now, as far as Hera goes, it's quite easy to epitomize her significance in myth, for better or worse. It's not a pleasant thing to report, but for the most part, Hera's stories, in one way or another, deal with Zeus. Why? Because first of all, let's face it, what culture we're talking about, where it comes from. Okay. There's no disguising that fact that we're talking about an extremely patriarchal society. Now, that's a really loaded word these days, okay? If you look at YouTube and you're aware of all the fights going on and this and that. But I can't ignore the fact that we're talking about a society where, until very late in its history, women had not only no political power, but absolutely no say over their own beings. I can't ignore that, okay? And so that culture is the one where these emphases exist. Hera, almost without exception, only occurs in myth when it's in relation to the very husband who's constantly cuckolding her. Okay? Now, what does that mean? What kinds of stories would you expect about Hera then? You would expect stories where she gets back at Zeus. So, you see what I'm getting at here, you guys? So what is her personality like? You almost never see her in any way other than extremely distraught and pissed. So you could be cynical and stand back and look at that and isolate it and say, oh, Hera is the female equivalent to Zeus. She's an asshole in her own right. You could do that if you want, but it's important to understand the context in which she is being this way. Okay? Now, that's not to say that she doesn't do stuff that's completely inexcusable. Okay, we'll get to that stuff later. There are things that she does that she doesn't have to do. There's no two ways about that. And so when you deal with these stories about Hera, they all almost all have in common, number one, she's pissed at Zeus, and number two, she's trying to do something about it. Now, what does she do about it? She can't get back at Zeus directly because Zeus makes it very clear to her at the end of book 1 of the Iliad that if she does, he's going to kick her. It's the first instance of domestic abuse, if you count verbal, which you should. And so the one scene that I want to, just to real quickly set it up, Achilles, by far the greatest warrior of the Greeks, is pissed off at one of his fellow Greeks. Okay, we're going to get way more into details later. Pissed off enough to say, screw you Greeks, I'm getting out of Dodge, we're all going home. We're getting away from the war. Okay? Then he goes to Mommy, who is a sea goddess, and says, hey, Mommy, can you please go up to Olympus and talk to Zeus and have Zeus do something for me? I want to keep it general. We'll get to the specifics later. Okay? That's what's going on there. This is Thetis. Achilles is mom. Okay? Achilles is half divine. So this is the scene that we're talking about. Hera sees this happening from a distance. And she says, Majesty, son of Cronus, what sort of thing have you spoken? Truly too much in time past I have not questioned nor probed you. So it gets across that she's, not constantly doing this. But you are entirely free to think out whatever pleases you. Now, though, I am terribly afraid you were won over by Thetis, the silver-footed, that's her epithet, we'll get to epithets later, the daughter of the sea's ancient. Okay, she's a sea goddess. For early in the morning she sat beside you and took your knees, just like this, okay? And I think you bowed your head in assent to do honor. Not think, it's obvious, because when he bowed his head, all of Olympus shook. Okay, and destroy many beside the ships of the Achaeans. Then Zeus says to her, Dear lady, I never escape you. You are always full of suspicion. Yet thus you can accomplish nothing surely, but be more distant from my heart than ever, and it will be the worse for you. Now get ready. If what you say is true, then that is the way I wish it. Okay, so let's stop there. Thus you can accomplish nothing surely, but be more distant from my heart than ever, and it will be the worse for you. If what you say is true, then that's the way I wish it. But then sit down in silence and do as I tell you, for fear all the gods, as many as there are in Olympus, so it'll be in front of everybody, can do nothing if I come close and lay my unconquerable hands upon you.